So chapter 8, key issue 2, is about why nation states are difficult to create. And again, we talked about nations and states a little bit in chapter 7, and we're going to describe them in a little bit more detail in chapter 8. So you should be able to differentiate between a nation state and a multinational state. You should be able to describe differences among states that were formerly in the Soviet Union. And you should be able to describe the patterns of distribution of ethnicities in Russia and the Caucasus. You should also be able to explain the concept of colonies and describe their current distribution. Remember that a nation state is a sovereign political territory that is made up of basically one nationality. A state that contains more than one ethnicity is called a multi-ethnic state. And we talked about that a little bit in chapter 7 as well. So the United States is a multi-ethnic state. We have more than one ethnicity. And in general, we form a single national identity, right? We consider ourselves United citizens no matter what our ethnicity is. But we aren't a nation state by any means, because we have so many different ethnicities, and because we have the different Native American tribes, right? And so those Native American groups make us technically a multinational state as well. Although we're not one that's like filled with conflict today. A multinational state is a country that contains more than one ethnicity with traditions of self-determination. So the one we're going to focus on today will be Russia. And we'll talk a little bit about Yugoslavia. Although we really focus on Yugoslavia in chapter 7 with the problems in the Balkan regions and how they have trouble breaking apart. So what are some examples of nation states? We talked a little bit about how Japan is an example of a nation state, right? And in Europe, Denmark, and I know we've talked about that before. 90% of the population is ethnic Danes. Almost all of them speak Danish. Slovenia is another example of a nation state in Europe. 83% of the population are ethnic Slovenes. It's difficult. You won't find a nation state with 100% one ethnicity living in it, because people travel and the world is filled with diversity. So to look at the difficulties in forming a nation state, let's look at independent nation states in the former Soviet Republic. So the Soviet Union consisted of 15 different republics that were based on its 15 largest ethnicities. These republics became independent states or countries consisting of 5 major groups. So at the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union broke into 15 different. So here they are here on this map. And we're going to kind of break them down by region. In many of these regions, the transition was far more peaceful than the transition from Yugoslavia breaking conflict, right? That's where the term Balkanization came from. When you're splitting something into more than one entity and it involves conflict. Right. So the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are in the Baltic region, and they are pretty peaceful. There's not much conflict there. So the Baltic area compared to the Balkan area was a very chill breakup, you could say. So in Estonia, most people are Protestant, primarily Lutheran, and they speak a Uralic language similar to Finnish. In Latvia, they are primarily Protestant and Lutheran, and they speak a Baltic group language. And in Lithuania, they are primarily Roman Catholic, and they speak a language in the Baltic group within the Balto-Slavic branch of the Indo-European family. There are 3 European states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, and these states all speak similar East Slavic languages and are predominantly Orthodox Christians. And then we have 5 Central Asian states that used to be part of the Soviet Union. So Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. These countries are primarily Muslim. They speak an Altic language group. We have Kyrgyzstan that was predominantly Muslims, and they speak an Altic language group. You have Pakistan, which is predominantly Muslim and speaks an Altic language group. And you have Tajikistan, which is predominantly Muslim, and they speak a language of the Indic group of the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European language family. So here you see the Central Asian countries, right? Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan. So a lot of these areas were controlled by the Mongols, and so they they are broken up into the Central Asian part of the Soviet, what was once the Soviet Union. Russia has 39 ethnicities in it that are clustered in 2 principal locations. So along borders with neighboring states, so you've got different ethnicities near Mongolia, and then you've got the Chechens, and then you've got the Dagestanis, all near Azerbaijan and Georgia. And then in the center of Russia, by the Volga River and the Ural Mountains, you have many other ethnic groups. You don't need to necessarily know the different names of the ethnic groups, because I think that could be a little bit overwhelming for you right now. But you need to know that Russia still has a lot of different ethnicities. And so you're going to see a pattern. So let's look at the patterns, right? Because we're in geography, look at spatial patterns. And so along the borders of other countries, you're going to see more ethnic groups, which makes sense, right? You're going to see along the borders of the Slavic nations, along the border closest to where another country is, that's where you're going to find different ethnic groups. So as you're looking at this map, look for spatial patterns. You're going to see that most people who are ethnically Russian are going to be here near Moscow, St. Petersburg. So these major areas, right? This is where most people in Russia end up living. And then you're going to have more ethnic clusters closer to the borders of different countries. And then you're going to have some indigenous tribes out in central Russia where less people live, a less populated area. So because Russia is such a large multinational state, it has a history of conflict. So the Caucasus region is situated between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and it's home to several ethnicities. So you've got the Azeris, the Armenians, and the Georgians. When the region broke up into independent countries, these conflicts and tensions that were always there, many of them have erupted into armed conflicts. So when we look at some of the problems going on in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, what we have to understand is that many of these ethnicities were controlled essentially by the Soviet Union, and when that power disappeared, you just had years of conflict kind of just simmering, and they kind of erupted into violence. So Georgia, not the state Georgia that's north of Florida, but the independent country, right? The geopolitical state, right here. It's right here by the Black Sea, and then you've got Armenia, which you've probably heard of, Azerbaijan, which you at least have heard of in the John Oliver clip we watched earlier this year. And you can see that these areas are right by Turkey. So you've got this is called the Caucasus area, and this area has a lot of different tensions. And look at the different ethnic groups you hear. So again, you've got lots of different ethnic groups, including Chechens, Georgians, Kurdish people. And so all of these different ethnicities can erupt in conflict, both in the southern part of Russia and in the Caucasus region. Another thing that can make a nation state difficult to create is the idea of colonialism. So a colony is a territory that's legally tied to another sovereign state, so it's not completely independent. So, and we've talked about colonialism and really the history of colonialism. So a sovereign state essentially may run its own military and foreign policy, and it controls its own internal affairs. When you have a colony, you are establishing your political policies, your economic policies, and your cultural practices on that territory. So colonies are not really sovereign states. They don't have much control over what's going on with their economy, their politics, or their culture. And we know that the practice of colonialism has made it difficult to establish states, and it's also led to boundaries that were drawn that didn't really correspond to the idea of self-determination of the people who lived there. And so sometimes when we ended the colonial and imperial times and we were given these states sovereignty, we didn't align their territories with what they would have wanted. We didn't really take the input from people who lived there. You can see that there are some existing colonies and territories today. This is showing you the colonial empire. And so you can see the boundaries that are existing today, and you can see who would have owned this territory. So when you're looking at the colonial powers, you can see that the United Kingdom today, here they are in South Asia, right? India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Canada, Australia, South Africa, parts of Central Africa, and Northern Africa. You can see the French colonial territories, a little bit in South America, but primarily here in Northern Africa. You can see where the Netherlands had their territory. And then you can see the country's boundaries today within there. And this alone can lead to the conflict we have today. So look, when we talk about, later when we talk about Western Sahara, most of this territory was controlled by the French, except for what's today's Western Sahara. And today Morocco and Western Sahara are still in a conflict about whether or not it's an independent state. And that conflict predates the colonial powers, but was definitely fed by this interaction here. So we have 68 places in the world that we call dependent areas. And these dependencies are these are territories that don't have complete sovereignty. So they are dependent on the decisions made by a sovereign state. Or we have areas of special sovereignty. 43 are indigenous populations and 25 have no permanent population. Most current colonies are islands in the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. So Puerto Rico, we've talked about before, is a commonwealth of the U.S. It's home to 4 million residents. They are U.S. citizens, but they aren't a part of the United States in many ways because they cannot participate in the U.S. elections and they do not have a voting member of Congress. So they're in this like limbo state, right? Like they get some of the benefits of being part of the United States, right? Like they are U.S. citizens, but they don't really have a voice. And so they fall into this area of dependencies. And this map here shows you areas that are either dependencies, territories, or areas of special sovereignty. And the place in parentheses shows you what is the sovereign state that kind of looks over that area. And you can see that most of the areas that are still considered territories are in the Pacific Islands or in the Caribbean. And so in addition to like Puerto Rico, it includes like the Virgin Islands, both the UK and the US Virgin Islands, St. Martin, and then you've got a lot of these Pacific Islands. And then some of your special sovereignty right here would be like Western Sahara. And then you've got I think that's the biggest example that you really need to worry about. And that's about it.